Hey everyone, it's Dave from Imaging Resource, and we have got a treat for you today. Check this out. It is the Nikon Z7, Nikon's first full-frame mirrorless, and oh boy, there's a lot to talk about here. We'll get into it. Right now I'm holding it. It's got a new dedicated 24 to 70 f4 lens on. These are the S lenses. There's going to be a whole new line of them to fit this camera specifically, and also an adapter we'll talk about in just a little bit. So just the basic speeds and feeds. It's got a 45.7 megapixel sensor. It's all new. It's got 493 AF points. We'll get into those a little bit more. They're pretty amazing. It's also 9 frames continuous shooting, and that's with autofocus on every frame. That was kind of a surprise to us. It's actually, for the highest speed, it locks the exposure on the first frame, but then the focus continues on every frame thereafter. If you don't want to lock the exposure, then it's 5.5 frames per second. So let's go into the details and talk about it a little bit. First thing I want to say is this thing feels really great. It's got a really nice, grip here. It's thin, but it's deep enough that even with fairly long fingers like mine, it's pretty comfortable. But at the same time, I think you could have a person with a much smaller hand, and they could get around that very easily. As I said, the whole thing is light. It's got a magnesium alloy body. It's really kind of surprisingly light again for a full frame. So this has got a 24 to 70 millimeter f4S lens on it. This is going to be a kit with the camera. You can get it either with this lens included or body only. One kind of interesting point on this lens here too, it's got a little bit of a latch, so you won't get zoom creep, but you don't have to have press a button to get it to unlock. So that's a nice feature. It just feels really balanced with this lens on there, and we try it with some larger lenses and some f-mount lenses adapted, and it's just a super comfortable camera. Another thing too is for Nikon shooters, Nikon really makes an effort to have their cameras feel the same, so that professional shooter, if he's got a D5 and a D850 and then this camera, the Z7 in his bag, he can pretty much grab them and know where things are and know how to control it. So it's got a very comfortable, very familiar user interface. It is absolutely pouring down rain here right now, and the rain on the skylights, you might be able to pick that up in the background, so apologies for the audio quality. But that does bring up another good point about the camera. This has the same weather sealing as the D850, which was a significant point in deciding on our camera of the year for 2017, and the native lenses for it are also well weather sealed. So this is a camera you'll be able to take out in pretty much any environment and not have to worry about whether it's going to get a little bit wet or not. So one of the things, talking about user interface, one of the things I really like on this camera is the EVF. It is just incredibly crisp and sharp. It's a 3.6 million dot, I think it's an OLED, but whatever it is, it's very sharp. And we've seen high dot EVFs before, but there's something about this that really struck me as being just sharper than usual. And it seems like part of that might be that it has really good optics built into the viewfinder. It looked like about 5 elements on the diagram that we saw, but they're Nikon optics. I mean, it's got like aspherics and things in it. It's however they do it, the end result is really amazing. It's just incredibly sharp in there. It also has a really wide field of view. I mean, you put your eye up to it, and what you're seeing in the viewfinder is taking up a significant chunk of your field of vision. And that's great because you can see a lot better, there's more detail, but it also at the same time, and kind of surprisingly for that, it has a pretty high eye point. And so even me with my glasses, I have to press the eye cup against my glasses a little bit, but I can look in there and really see every corner of the viewfinder frame without having to move my eye around. It's also got a beautiful display on the back. It's a 3.2 inch, 2.1 million dot. But it is a fully touchscreen monitor, so you can control pretty much anything that you want just with your finger. Or of course, all of this shows up in the EVF, so you can manipulate the buttons on the back while you're looking through the EVF to make the changes. One thing about it, usually we're accustomed with it's tough with a EVF camera to get really good battery life. And this thing, it's actually rated for like 330 shots per charge, but it seems like the pros in the field, what we're hearing back, is that they're getting a lot more shots than that on a battery. I mean, hundreds. And part of that might be that there's this control on the side here, and that lets you put it into a mode where it turns off the rear panel LCD unless you're specifically asking for a menu to be displayed or something like that. And it also leaves the EVF off until you bring it to your eye. And so that way it's just like an optical viewfinder DSLR from Nikon. But in that mode, we think that might be why some people are getting such long battery life out of it. Oh, another concern for existing Nikon shooters is the battery. What are you going to do with those, dozens of EN-EL15s you have? Well, the great news is you can use them. The battery that comes in the Z7 is called an EN-EL15B. And the difference with the B is that in this camera you can charge via USB. Now an EN-EL15A will give you exactly the same capacity, you just don't get the in-camera charging. And then of course your original EN-EL15s, which are probably getting a little old and tired anyway, those will work perfectly fine, they just don't have as much capacity as the newer ones. So that's a nice touch. You can use those dozens of batteries you're carrying around, they still work just fine in the Z7. So let's talk about the lenses for a minute. As I said before, this is the 24-70 that will be sold as a kit with the camera. One interesting thing about these S-series lenses, which is what they're calling the lenses for the Z mount, is they have a control ring back here that can be multifunction. By default, it'll do focus, but you can also have it do set the aperture or adjust the exposure compensation. So that's kind of cool. It's controllable by a custom settings menu. And one thing that stands out immediately when you look at this thing is the lens flange is huge. It's a 55 millimeter diameter inner dimension on that, and that has some important consequences I'll talk about in just a moment. It also has a very, very short, very shallow flange depth. It's only 16 millimeters from the front of the flange to the front of the sensor. And so that has some good consequences in terms of the engineering trade-offs for designing lenses for it. This new mount, so the traditional F mount has got 3 claws on it. With this new large mount, they went to a 4-claw design on the flange. So it basically, I think that's really about just ensuring a tighter coupling, a really rigid connection across that much larger an area. So it's going to come the 24-70. Also announced and available in a similar time frame will be a 35 millimeter f1.8, and announced but not available until a little bit later, I think November, there's going to be a 50 millimeter f1.8. I mentioned the very wide flange here, and that was I think that's really significant in that Nikon didn't just decide they're going to take a mirror out of an existing f mount and then stick a shorter flange on it. What they did is they really decided that, look, this is going to be the next generation of Nikon. This is like, they like to say, maybe the next 100 years. So they realizing the importance of that, they started from a clean sheet of paper and they said, what size should the lens flange be and where should it be mounted? And so having a wider flange and that really shallow back focus, that gives them a lot of flexibility and options in the lens design that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And we're told that this combination of flange depth and flange size means that it'll have the capability of going as wide as an f/0.95 lens. So boy, we can't wait to see something like that. Of course, I'm sure it's going to cost accordingly, but it's really it's interesting that if they hadn't done this larger flange, they wouldn't have been able to do something like that. The other thing that's interesting is the native lenses for this, these S-series lenses. We're told that they're designed to be at their maximum sharpness wide open, and that's really significant. I mean, anyone that's been in photography for any amount of time, you're accustomed to, it's like, okay, it's an f1.4, you will stop down to 1.8 or maybe 2, and then we'll get a nice look at the, nice look on the image. But these things, they are designed to be maximum sharpness wide open. So when it's an f1.4, f1.8 lens, you can actually use that f1.8 to shoot with. Now, another thing, anyone that's got a Nikon shooter now is saying, hey, what about all my F-mount lenses? Well, here we are. We've got a F-mount, the FTZ adapter. It's basically F2Z adapter, and it just goes right on the front. But I'm really encouraged about this for a couple of reasons. One is that there's not a lot of stuff in here. It doesn't, so this won't support like the old screwdriver drive lenses, but any of the like AFS models will be able to work on it. The other thing I really like about it is the design. It's got a little tripod foot on the bottom, and I didn't think anything of it at first, but it's like the moment I picked it up, it just rests right in the palm of my hand. And then it's interesting because that can kind of carry the weight of a larger lens, and then my hands are free, my fingers are free to work the zoom or the focus ring. And it's hard to describe. I mean, it really actually adds to the ergonomics of the camera, having that adapter on there. So I think that people that are existing Nikon shooters that have a big library of F-mount lenses are going to be very, very happy. Which does bring up the other question. The big question in a lot of people's minds is, what about autofocus? How is this thing going to autofocus? Are we going to be able to put our f-mount lenses on there and use them the same as we're using them on our D850s, D5s, etc.? Well, the answer seems to be yes. That's something that had been a big concern of ours, and so we asked Nikon, what is the difference in performance going to be? How's it going to behave? They said it's going to be exactly the same. There should be no reduction in autofocus performance between the like of a D850 and the Z7. So if that's true, that's quite a statement. Now, another thing that's interesting here too is, and this is, I believe, a consequence of that really large flange. And again, I don't know how it plays out with the f-mount lenses, but having such a large flange, you can get light rays into the sensor from a lot more angles, or a lot wider angle. And what that means is that their phase detect autofocus points can cover a lot more of the sensor surface. So there's 493 AF points. But the significant thing is they cover 90% of the frame, 90% vertically, 90% horizontally. I mean, your subject can go pretty much anywhere in the frame, and this camera is going to be able to track it. We were actually having a conversation the other day, and one of us said, well, gee, do we really need to, I'm not going to put a subject out in the corner of the frame. Is that really important? But what I think is that, I'm not a great shooter. I'm not a great shooter of any kind, but especially when it comes to sports. And so, pro sports shooter's there, and he's at 400 millimeters, and he's got the guy's face in the center of his frame. Me, I'm at 150 millimeters. I'm trying to keep the player in the field, the player in the screen. What I think this is key about this, or one of the things that's key about this very wide AF area, is that the camera can track. So, a duffer like me, if I'm shooting and the player, the subject I'm shooting ends up, wandering to the edge of the frame and then back again, the focus will be able to track it. So I may not shoot it when it's way out in the corner, but the camera can be tracking it so I don't lose focus. And when it comes back in and I get the framing I want, the camera's right there with me. And so also in focus, it's a hybrid autofocus system all the time, whether for still or videos. And that means it's got phase detect contrast points all across the sensor, and it also does contrast detect. And what was interesting to me, so usually phase detect autofocus on a camera that's got the on-chip phase detect points, it doesn't get you all the way there. It's like it gets you kind of close, and then contrast detect has to take it the rest of the way. What is interesting, what Nikon told me with this, is that it uses contrast detect if it has to, but that many times it will go all the way to the final focus with just phase detect. And again, we have a lot of testing to do with this thing once we get it back into their lab and we get a test sample. But in just playing around with it, I never had a sense that it was hunting. Which I would have expected if it was using contrast detect much. Like, phase detect will get there, and then for contrast detect to tell whether it's really in focus or not, it's going to wobble a little bit, go a little bit closer, a little bit further, and see whether it gets sharper or not. And I just really wasn't seeing any wobbling. Also, the little bit of video that we played with on it, the video focus seemed to be very, very good. Now, this camera, a first for a Nikon full-frame camera, is it has built-in body-based image stabilization, and with the native lenses it's a full 5-axis stabilization. So that means you've got pitch, you've got yaw, you've got X and Y translation, and also roll. And it's interesting how this interacts with non-native lenses. So if you have an existing Nikon VR lens, and normally those will be just pitch and yaw, when you put it on this body through the adapter, you pick up the roll axis. And likewise, non-VR lenses will also get 3-axis stabilization, pitch, yaw, and roll. And we're told that it's up to 5 stops. And of course, that's, your mileage may vary. It depends on the situation, the lens. We found actually that the amount of benefit you get from image stabilization is a lot dependent on how bad a photographer you are when it comes to holding the camera. That actually people who are shakier tend to get more stops of improvement than people who start out very steady. But nonetheless, up to 5 stops, and that's really right up there with where the market is these days. Let's talk really briefly about video. I'm not a video guy. We have Jaron Schneider works for us as our sort of video guru, but I'm here and he's not, so I'll talk about video. This camera really has a lot of video chops. I mean, it's got the obvious, external mic and headphone jacks. It's got an HDMI connection for clean HDMI out. It does provide time code. and it'll record 4K ultra high def full frame, the full width of the sensor, at up to 30 frames per second, and it can do 8K video in time-lapse mode. Now when it crops down, so the width of the frame for high def stays the same, but it crops a little bit top and bottom to get to the 16:9 ratio. When you do that, the number of AF points goes down to 435. So similar coverage on the frame, it's just that you don't have as much frame to work with. It shoots from ISO 64 to 25:6 in video mode, and in full high def, the standard 1080, it can go to 120 frames per second for slow-mo. Now another cool thing here that I think this is something Jaron especially probably like is there's a log recording function on it, but it's N-log as opposed to S-log or some other kind of log. And what's interesting is that it's a 10-bit log recording. So what that means, so log recording, you're basically compressing your dynamic range so you make sure that when you're recording, so that you make sure you have headroom and you've got room for highlights to get brighter, etc. And normally, you're compressing the video, you're doing that log, or the tonality, you're doing that compression into an 8-bit resolution. That means you have the levels that you can see are 256 levels. Now they're spread non-linearly, but you basically only have 256 levels. So if you try to do a really major adjustment on your exposure, you can get banding or quantization, stair-stepping. With the 10-bit log, you've got 1,024 levels. So you basically have 4 times the gradation, the resolution or the smoothness of the gradation, tonal gradation, that you do with other log systems. So I think that's going to be a big feature for a lot of video shooters. Also, it's kind of incidental, but if you're recording in 4K, you push the shutter button totally silently and without stopping the video, you get a 4K, basically an 8 megapixel image from the video stream. Oh, and speaking of video, and again, this is a nice feature for someone who's using this camera to shoot both stills and videos. There is now a 16:9 aspect ratio in the still mode, so you can shoot stills at the same aspect ratio as your video, and that makes it so much easier just to drop in a still in post. You're not having to take it to Lightroom and crop it and bring it over. It just drops in seamlessly. Video recording, of course, it's the standard 2959 restriction, thanks to our friends in Europe with the tax codes. And the output, I should have mentioned too, the N-log, the 10-bit N-log output is only to the external recorder via the HDMI, and that's in 422 mode going through to the external recorder. Internally, you can record normal tonality. If you're not doing the N-log thing, you can record 8-bit 422 4K to both the internal card and also out through the HDMI to an external recorder. So that's nice versatility. Oh, and let's talk about storage for a little bit. The Z7 uses an XQD card, which is the nice fast format. This card I'm holding here is rated to 440 megabytes per second. And what's coming is the CF Express standard, and that's going to go even faster. But it'll be in the same form factor, and what's nice is the Z7 is future-proof from the standpoint that just with a firmware update, it'll be able to also read the CF Express cards. And I have to say, I love shooting with XQDs. The buffers clear so fast. That's been a gripe of mine with some cameras. It's like, yeah, it's got 200 shots in the buffer, and it's going to take you 3 minutes to empty it. We don't have specs for buffer clearing on this yet. Of course, this is a prototype. We'll do a full test once we get it. I can say, though, that buffer depths, the rating is it has both 14 and 12-bit RAW. So with 14-bit RAW, you get 18 shots in the buffer before it slows down. With 12-bit, you get 23 shots, and with fine quality full-size JPEGs, you get 25 frames per buffer. And again, though, with I'm expecting with the XQD card that buffer is going to clear very, very quickly. So how does this compare with other cameras? Let's take a look at our other favorite Nikon, the D850. And as you can see, there's a little bit of size difference there. It's kind of funny too, looking at the front and just seeing just how much bigger this flange is than the one on the D850. So a lot bigger and heavier, obviously. But I actually find that the grip on the Z7 I like better than the D850. The D850's got a very comfortable grip. Somehow the Z7, they've done something special. It feels like there's, even though the flange is so much wider, it feels like there's maybe more room for my fingers in there somehow. So it's a very nice feeling camera, and just everything's very similar in terms of how it operates. Obviously, you don't have this row of buttons down the left. There's not that space on the body, but the user interface is very similar. Now let's compare it to another popular camera. This is a Sony A7R Mark III. And you can see the size is actually pretty different. Heft is pretty close. I'm not sure it'd be a gram one way or the other. You can see that Sony has a very wide flange, but this flange is so much bigger. So I think we're going to be able to see, as we talked about earlier, much faster lenses available for this, and fast lenses that are very uniform from corner to corner in the frame. But here's an interesting usability point too. Check out the amount. I'm going to try standing it up and see if that works. Check out the amount that the viewfinder eyepiece projects back from the surface of the camera. And with the Sony, this distance here is pretty short. So you put it up to your face and your nose hits the screen all the time. I hate that. It happens to me in a lot of cameras. With the Z7, the viewfinder eyepiece projects out just a bit more. I mean, it's a good few millimeters, and that, I think, can make all the difference. I certainly found it, as I mentioned before, very comfortable to use this, even as an eyeglass wearer. So that's just a nice little ergonomic point. And of course, the Z7 has got the D850's weather sealing, and that's going to be a big factor for a lot of people, I think. One more thing. We knew that there was something coming. We kind of expected a full frame mirrorless from Nikon. And when they came and gave us our briefing, they went through all the specs of the Z7, and then they said, oh, and one more thing, there's going to be a Z6. It'll be announced at the same time. In fact, as you're watching this will be after the official announcement, and so everyone will know about it already. But it was kind of a nice surprise to us. It's basically exactly the same specs, except it's a 24.5 megapixel sensor instead of the 45.7. And the other differences are that it can shoot up to 12 frames per second. Of course, the smaller sensor, the lower resolution, there are fewer AF points, so you have 273 AF points. And also, when you're shooting video, the 4K video full frame is basically pixel for pixel. It's basically the width of the sensor and those pixels. That's the width of the video. I think that pretty much wraps up what we're able to talk about right now with it. As I say, there's a lot of other things to talk about. We'll cover that in our review as we, once we get a hands-on sample in-house. We're going to be putting the autofocus through its paces. That's going to be a huge item of interest for many people. But to hear Nikon say that there should be identical performance on a lens-by-lens basis to existing DSLRs is really an extraordinary statement. So this, I think I can confidently say, this is what Nikon shooters have been waiting for a long time, and I think there's going to be a huge pent-up demand for it. Well, thanks for staying with us and looking at this. Let us know in the comments below what you think. If you've got questions, you can post them there, or come on over to our product page for the Z7, and we'll monitor that and try to answer any questions people have about it. We know there's going to be a lot of interest in this baby. Just can't wait to get one back and have our hands on it for a while. Get your orders in early.